This is the Insider's Guide to Real Estate, and I'm Victor Normand, your host. Today we go to law and the real estate. My guest today is a local attorney, Mark Shire, who has been an attorney for over 40 years, specializes in real estate at the firm of Shire, Caton, and Epstein. So please join me in welcoming Mark to our program.
Thank you, Victor. I'm happy to be here.
I'm glad you're here. So let's start right off. We have buyers and sellers, and we have third parties in the mix, and now there's a big role for lawyers in real estate transactions. So describe essentially what the need for an attorney in a real estate transaction is.
Well, they're really, from a buyer's standpoint, you can, in a residential real estate transaction, you have a seller, a buyer, and typically a mortgage lender. So you have three opportunities for legal representation. When we represent a buyer in a transaction, if we're approved as attorneys for the buyer's lender, we can actually do that dual representation, represent the lender and the buyer at the same time. And that is typical and customary in Massachusetts. Of course, you can't represent the seller and the buyer as much as we'd like to.
Sure.
You can't do that. But it's very important. I think it's more important for a buyer to be represented. I mean, I think as a real estate attorney, I think both parties certainly should be represented by counsel, but I think a buyer, there's a more compelling reason for a buyer to be represented.
Sure. So as a real estate agent, we always recommend, of course, to our clients that they seek legal representation, and often, unfortunately, that doesn't really happen until after there is an accepted offer on a property, and an offer just outlines the basic business terms of a real estate transaction. But it's a contract. It's a binding contract. And so a lawyer often enters the mix right after that. Let's talk about this offer and why it is a binding contract.
Yeah, the offer, many people really kind of downplay the offer. They feel it's almost like a letter of intent that has no real legal meaning. And everything that is really geared to favor the seller except the offer to purchase, because the offer to purchase absolutely binds the seller to those terms. The seller really has to go forward in good faith and complete the transaction and complete the purchase and sales agreement. A buyer, on the other hand, usually puts $1,000 down as a deposit, signs the offer, and then if the buyer decides to change his or her mind, they can walk away from that $1,000 and that's the end of it. If a seller says, whoops, I made a terrible mistake, or has an offer for $40,000, right around the corner, they cannot change their mind because they are absolutely bound to the terms of that offer.
Now, there's a term in real estate called specific performance, and it's pretty unique to real estate. Tell us exactly what that is.
Well, if a seller does not perform, if a seller defaults and basically says, I'm not going to sell this property to you, or I'm not going to proceed with the purchase and sales agreement, the buyer has the option at that point of going to court and seeking what's called specific performance of the contract. And that is to compel the seller to proceed with the contract and honor the contract. And in addition to specific performance, the seller could also be liable for other consequential damages.
Sure. So that effectively blocks the seller from doing anything else with that property. In other matters of law, disputes can be reduced to damages, but not so in real estate. Again, the specific performance aspect is really quite unique to real estate,
right,
as I understand it.
And in real estate, you have really two types of damages. Typically, in any real estate purchase and sales agreement, the buyer's damages will be limited to the amount of the deposit. And typically right now, we have a 5% deposit, which is the norm. Sometimes it's a little bit bigger or sometimes smaller, but most of the agreements have a 5% deposit. And if the buyer defaults, then the buyer loses that deposit, but the seller is foreclosed from bringing any action above that. So that's the extent of the buyer's damages. But the seller, on the other hand, the measure of damages is the specific performance of the contract.
Delivering the house,
Yes,
actually.
exactly.
Sure. So now you mentioned $1,000 deposit with an offer and a 5% deposit with a purchase and sale, but those aren't negotiable numbers. There's nothing in law that says it.
No, it's just customary.
Sure. So now there's an accepted offer on a property. There are contingencies. While those contingencies are being satisfied, a home inspection, mortgage, securing a mortgage, preparing for a mortgage application, there's the drafting of a contract, which is the purchase and sale agreement. And typically, the purchase and sale agreement is drafted by the seller, and not surprisingly, it's drafted in the seller's favor. So, as a buyer's attorney, how do you correct for that?
Okay, what we do is, first of all, you're absolutely right. The purchase and sales agreement is geared to favor the seller. It's somewhat like a lease. Any form lease always favors the landlord. Any form purchase and sales agreement favors the seller. And it doesn't as much favor the seller in what's included in the agreement, but it favors the seller in what's not included in the agreement. So as buyer's counsel, we add, most attorneys will add an addendum to the agreement that will deal with all kinds of issues that we feel are necessary to protect our buyer client.
So if, for instance, if a seller has a provision in the contract that allows them additional time to deliver the property, your addendum might qualify that. Might say, okay, you have additional time, but there are compensation to my client, for instance.
Okay, well, I can give you a good example of that. In the form purchase and sales agreement, if the seller could not give good title to the property, typically there's a 30-day extension where the seller must use reasonable efforts to correct any title defects. Now, during that 30-day period, my buyer client's mortgage rate might change, or their commitment might be revoked. So I put a provision saying that during that 30-day period, if my client's mortgage commitment does not stay in full force, then my client has a right to terminate the agreement or renegotiate the contract.
Right. So it's an example of what provisions you would include in a contract.
Right, the changes that we would make. We make changes both to the body of the purchase and sales agreement and then add an addendum to it.
Sure. And typically a seller's attorney would not be surprised to see that kind of change.
No. And once again, we've done so many agreements. In this area, the real estate law community is a very close one. We're all competitors, but for the most part, we're very friendly competitors. We have a sense of what's fair in agreement and what's not fair in agreement, and we pretty much know what's going to work. Every now and then, I have a clause in my agreement that I try to get in. It's called the death clause, and it states that if one of my clients dies during the pendency of the contract, then they get their money back.
They have the option to get the money back.
The seller has to give the deposit back because there would most likely be a default in that situation. Some sellers' attorneys won't go for that. Some sellers' attorneys will agree to it. So there are some times when you kind of stretch a bit with your rider, things that you want to get in, and that's where you start really negotiating with the other attorney. And that, on the seller side too, you have the same situation.
Sure. And so it's at the end of the day, you want to get it right because it is a binding. It's a deal. Once it's signed off, then you don't make changes to it unless both sides agree.
Exactly.
So let's take an extreme situation where you have a cash sale with no contingencies. How simple would from a legal point of view, how simple would that transaction be?
It would be a lot simpler because you have so much less paperwork because you don't have the whole mortgage process. And the mortgage process is becoming more and more complicated, more and more paperwork heavy. When I first started practicing law about 40 years ago, I remember my first closing. There were 6 documents at the closing. Now it seems like for every year I've practiced law, they've added a document. So typically at a closing you have about 50 documents. Maybe 5 or 6 of them are really important documents, and the rest of them are of less importance.
Yeah, they're appendages that have just outlived their usefulness. I've attended scores of real estate closings, and I've seen this urea formaldehyde form,
That's right.
and I don't know whenever anyone has said yes, it is present in my house.
Well, it's funny because the form that has to be signed references the urea formaldehyde statute. Well, that statute was revoked about 6 years ago. But once again, forms never leave
Apparently not.
closings. They always get added to closings.
So what really complicates a transaction is this third party. You have the buyer and seller, and you have the lender, and the lender is represented by counsel. They need to protect their investment, and so that has led to every time there's some kind of a flaw or a hiccup in a transaction, it generates a new form that folks have to sign. So tell us, now the lenders, there is some uniformity though with respect to these, even though there are any number of lenders, there's some uniformity to these forms. And why does that exist?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of uniformity. It used to be 20 or 30 years ago. Each lender had its own set of documents. So you really have to review the documents. Now with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, everyone's heard of those organizations. Those are quasi-governmental organizations that are responsible for purchasing the majority of mortgages that are originated in the United States. And so Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac has said, since we're going to be buying all these mortgages, we want to make sure that all the documentation is exactly the same. So you have the Fannie Mae mortgage note, you have the Fannie Mae mortgage, and a lot of other Fannie Mae documents. So everything at this point is pretty generic. You can have a closing in Idaho and a closing in Acton, Massachusetts, and you'll be looking at the exact same form of major documents: note, mortgage, settlement statement, disclosure statement, and so forth.
And that makes a lot of sense. Actually, it's more than a majority. I think it's close to 90%
Right,
of
yes.
all mortgages pass through
Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac.
Freddie Mac.
Right,
And
yeah.
what they do is repackage them and sell them off as bonds. And so the need for uniformity is obvious under those circumstances. But not all, there are private investors who buy mortgages, but they pretty much rely on the forms and processes of third-party
exactly.
lenders.
They're just riding the coattails of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and making sure that those documents conform with those requirements.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the services that an attorney is required to provide to a lender is to provide good title, to determine that the title to the property is in good form. So tell us what title insurance is all about.
Okay, well, title insurance is really important. It's really makes everything happen. It protects the mortgage lender. The lender's title insurance is mandatory. Every mortgage lender requires that. The owner's title insurance is optional, but I would say probably 80 to 90% of people get title insurance. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about title insurance. A lot of people think that when they buy the lender's title insurance, it protects them. If they get, say they're buying a $400,000 house and they're getting a 90% mortgage. So the lender's title insurance would be $370,000. And in essence, title insurance protects the lender against any title defects. That's what title insurance, in 10 words or less, if I had to describe title insurance, it protects against title defects. However, the lender's title insurance provides no protection to the owner at all. The lender's title insurance becomes relevant only if the lender has to foreclose on the property, take the property back, and then can't sell the property because of a title defect. So it's advisable for people to get owner's title insurance. It covers them for the duration of their ownership. It's so important because as closing attorneys, we do a 50-year title search. That is the requirement under Massachusetts general laws.
Okay. Let's just in one sense, what is title to the property? And we use it all the time, but
Well,
exactly what is it?
title to the property is your deed. You get a deed from the seller, and by recording of the deed, you then take title to that property.
So that the deed establishes ownership. So you want to be sure that what the title or the deed that I'm giving you, and I'm giving you what my stake in this property, you want to be sure that what I'm giving you has history behind it that allows me to give it to you.
And that's why you do a title search. You do a title search to determine the history of the title. You make sure that there are any liens that affect the property, and there could be any types of liens. It could be a Medicaid lien or some old mortgage or so forth, and you need those to be cleaned up. And that's a good part of what we do. Is there's so many documents floating around right now with everything that's happened in the financial industry and mortgages being sold and assigned and the paperwork just not being memorialized. There's a lot of sloppiness out there.
Sure. So it's not a question. Rarely is it a question of somebody being deceptive. It's rather somebody
being sloppy.
Yeah, forgetting to do something or following, recording something that needed to be recorded or taking something off a record that needs
Right. I would say that probably half the deals that we do, there's some type of corrective action that has to be taken in order to make the closing happen.
Okay. So now I've purchased title insurance on my property. Several years later, I go to sell it, and the bank's title attorney finds a flaw in my title. So again, it's procedure ministerial to correct, but that could take months, and I have a deal to sell my house. So how does title insurance help me out there?
Oh, that's a great question, because that's where title insurance really helps people. Most title insurance companies, all title insurance companies, cooperate with one another. If, say, there is a missing mortgage discharge or a missing mortgage assignment, something that gets in the way of conveying good, clear record, marketable title, which is the standard, then you will have one title insurance company then indemnifying the title insurance company that will be writing the title insurance on the purchase. And the two of them will get together and allow the closing to go through and allow the closing attorney to write what's called a clean title insurance policy that will protect the lender and the buyer.
So although it may take months or longer to straighten out a title situation, my deal goes forward and I have good title to my property.
Right. A lot of people think of title insurance as there's Native American claims wiping out their property. That's the classic title insurance policy. But title insurance, really, the value of it is that we've had so many closings that could have gone south and not happened. So many closings that were able to go through because the title insurance because the person had owner's title insurance.
So purchasing title insurance is an important part of real estate closing. There's another document that comes up, and that's a homestead document.
The Declaration of Homestead, sure.
So what is there is statutory protection, and then there's protection beyond that. So tell us about homestead.
Well, a Declaration of Homestead is a document that you sign and record at the closing. And what it does, it exempts $500,000 of your equity in the property, not your value, your equity in the property, from any creditor's claims. If you get sued, if you have to file bankruptcy, you're protected. That is exempt from that. So you can keep your house. They can't sell your house at a sheriff's sale. If you don't file a declaration of homestead at the registry, you still get an automatic $125,000 protection. So, many people don't have that much equity in their home, so their home is fully protected. So the homestead protection is something that's really important to have for people who are over the age of 62. you can, with a husband and wife, you can each file what's called, you should pardon the expression, an elderly homestead, and then your protection doubles. You can stack it, so you have $1 million protection.
So the purpose of homestead, recording a homestead on a home is no matter how bad life may get or how unfortunate your situation may be, you'll always have a home.
That's right.
But there are certain types of claims that a homestead does not protect you against.
Yeah, homestead doesn't protect you against the mortgage. That would be too much, you know. But a homestead doesn't protect you against real estate taxes or the IRS. It doesn't protect you against other types of liens. It doesn't protect you against child support orders, but it does protect you against lawsuits. If you get into an auto accident and you don't have proper insurance coverage, or there's a tremendous claim, then that homestead protects you. The other thing is that's so important about the homestead, and we've had a number of clients that have had their homes protected, is that if you're in a situation where the claim is so high that your only option is to file bankruptcy, you can actually file a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, which is a complete liquidation, and you can keep your home with up to that $500,000 of equity, and any attachments or claims against your home that would be covered by the homestead would essentially be wiped out in that bankruptcy. So then we've had probably my law partner, Michael Caton, handles the bankruptcy work in the office, and we've probably had about 8 or 9 people have their homes saved because of the homestead.
So it's one of those insurance protections, if you will, that rarely gets used, but it's important to have it
Yeah,
in
it really
place.
is. And it's a real no-brainer. It's so simple to do a homestead, and you only do it once, and it's good for as long as you own the property.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's, what else? So what about, you know, let's go back a bit, the whole process. And we've kind of looked at some of the high points associated with a purchase and sale agreement, but from your first encounter with a buyer, what's the process that you use to organize all the things that need to happen to get to a closing?
Well, the first thing that I like to do is to explain the process to my client, because most people have no idea about the home buying process. It's just a foreign land to them. And what I try to explain to people is that it seems so complicated to people, and it seems like a foreign language, but it's basically a pretty straightforward process. And I explain to them what we do as closing attorneys, as bank attorneys. We make sure that the title is good to the property. We make sure that the taxes are paid. We make sure that any mortgages are paid off. And also explain to them whatever affects their property.
Sure.
If there's an easement on their property or some kind of restriction, we go over that with them. And just what we try to do is demystify the process.
Right. So I could imagine that during this process that you're talking about, you're actually building a relationship with your client, because no matter how attentive they may be at all this, when you get to a closing, it's overwhelming. To be truthful about it, and you really do rely on your attorney to look out for your best interests and make sure the whole thing goes smoothly. Anything about post-closing? Now the deal is done, keys are given to the new buyer. Any role for an attorney beyond that?
Well, lots of times, people will come back to us if there are tax adjustments that have to be made after closing, because lots of times you will base your adjustments on last year's taxes because you don't have the new information. Sometimes somebody will call, we have issues with escrows sometime. I've got a closing today where there's going to be a $2,500 escrow because of a stove situation. So there is a good amount of follow-up with a lot of closings.
Sure, there could be holdbacks, I think is what you're referring to.
Holdbacks or escrows, right.
And
exactly.
those usually have a time limit associated with them, and so
Right.
that's an instance where you would remain involved in a transaction after a closing.
Right. Exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've come to the end. Any final words of advice or wisdom?
Well,
for our viewers?
I will, as a real estate attorney, I would just tell people to get an attorney because it just makes everything so much easier for people, and it just it's it's the biggest investment of your life.
It sure is,
You should be represented.
The value of the investment is going up, and so is the paperwork associated with buying a house. So thanks very much
Victor,
for being
thank
here.
you.
Okay,
Appreciate
very
it.
good. And that's our show for today. Thanks for watching.